Today, Andrew Pickering is giving a talk on being in an environment. Andrew Pickering has a PhD in physics from the University of London, as well as a PhD in science studies from the University of Edinburgh. And his current research is on art, agency, the environment, and traditional Chinese philosophy, which also feeds into this talk tonight. And I'm very excited to hear you talk. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now, can you hear me if I stand here and speak like this? Is it too loud? Shall I? No? Okay. Well, it's nice to see all of these happy, smiling faces. It's great to be back in Edinburgh. I lived here from 1976 till 1984, looking at the legendary Science Studies unit, which was then at, I want to say 32 Pickering Place, or was it 34? The postcode was EH89JT. People used to write letters in those days. I wrote my first book here in Edinburgh, Constructing Quarks. I wrote it longhand with a fountain pen. In 1984, very reluctantly, I left Bransfield Place and moved to America in search of paid employment, which amazingly I found. And in 1995, I published a book called The Mangle of Practice, Time, Agency and Science. And what I came up with in that book has been central to my work ever since. Everything I've done over the past 20 years grew out of that book. So there's a bit of cheap advertising, that's what the book looks like. The analysis of scientific practice that I've laid out in this book was straightforward enough, I thought, and most people seem to get the hang of it. But as I've developed the story further over the succeeding years, things have got a bit weird. Though it all makes sense to me, in the last few years I've increasingly had the sense that I've talked my way out of all known academic discourses. I feel a bit strange. So one thing I want to do today is just to clarify my position as well as I can, and at the same time to relate it to environmental questions. The key move in this book, The Mangle of Practice, was to focus on performance rather than cognition, on doing rather than thinking. This is the theme that runs through this talk. We've all been taught to think of science as primarily a cognitive activity, the production of knowledge about the world. But my argument was that if you want to understand scientific practice, you should start by thinking about A, the performance of scientists, what scientists do, B, the performance of the material world, what things do in the laboratory, and C, how these performances are interlaced with one another. Now, you might think this is obvious. Of course, scientists struggle with the material world and try to come to terms with it. How else would they get any purchase on their subject matter? But actually, at least as far as the dominant academic traditions are concerned, it isn't obvious. The natural sciences tell us stories about how the material world is. The social sciences do the same for the human world, but neither of them talk about performative struggles between the two, between people and things, the human and the non-human. There's a spectacular silence, a striking lack of systematic thought on this topic. To that extent, I think Western education continually reproduces a Cartesian cognitivism and a dualism of people and things. The academy is dualist in its very structure. Now, it might be that there's a reason for this silence, namely, there's nothing worth saying about performative interactions of people and things. But in the Mangle, this book, I did develop a few concepts that seemed to me to get somewhere, that broke the scholarly silence in interesting ways that are worth taking further. One of the concepts was agency, a term that I used to refer directly to action, doing things that are consequential in the world. The key idea of the Mangle was that scientific practice has the character of what I call a dance of agency between people and things, between the human and the non-human. The first case study in the book was about Donald Glazer's work in the 1950s, developing a thing called a bubble chamber as a new device for experimental particle physics. And very simply, along the way to the finished device, Glazer built all sorts of setups. Then he would stand back with a movie camera in his hand to record what these setups would do. Then he would react to that, somehow reconfiguring the setup. Then he would see, he would stand back again and see what it would do, back and forth between himself and the chamber. So this passage of practice is a nice example of what I mean by a dance of human and non-human agency. Sometimes Glazer acted as a classical human agent, then he would become passive and the apparatus took over the active role, doing its thing. Then Glazer took over again, back and forth, and eventually a working bubble chamber emerged at the end, and Donald Glazer got the Nobel Prize for what he'd done. Just to give you some ideas, there's some little prototype chambers at the top left. This is time-lapse photography of what's happening in the chamber. In this case, a track is being produced. I show you this just to give you a sense of the agency of the thing. The thing is doing that. And that's one of the photographs of particle tracks that came out of one of Glazer's early bubble chambers. Alright, this is all pretty simple and obvious. Nobody has ever disputed that this is how things actually go. But still, it's where my journey into academic outer space started. As I said, there's just no room for talking about these performative dances of agency within the mainstream disciplines. Importantly here, dances of agency are symmetric. They don't centre on or privilege the human, for example. We are agents, but so are rocks and stones, cats and bubble chambers. All of these things act and interact. And especially as far as the human sciences are concerned, symmetry is heresy. The human sciences play out a sort of human exceptionalism, dwelling endlessly on what's so special about us humans. Souls, mind, consciousness, reason, language, representation, will, intentionality, values, etc., etc. That's what's supposed to be special about us, and it's what the human sciences dwell on endlessly. Refusing this exceptionalism, refusing to centre an asymmetric story on human specialness, is what first put me, I think, beyond the pale of polite society. One other remark, and then we can move on to the environment. Agency, as I use the word, is emergent in practice in a brutal sense. Scientists don't know how material setups will perform in advance. Glazer had to find out what his instruments would do by building them. Likewise, even Glazer himself didn't know in advance how he, Glazer, would react to the performance of these setups. Human agency is emergent too, in just that sense. That means that traditional causal interpretations of action are importantly misleading, and that we need to think instead about forward-looking evolutionary processes, dances of agency that explore a world of endless emergence and becoming. My story of the mangle was a way of trying to conceptualize just that. Okay, after writing the mangle, I began to think about ways of generalizing the story beyond the laboratory. At the end of the book, I claimed that the mangle was a theory of everything, in my usual modest fashion. And I quickly realized that our relations with animals, nature, and the environment are an obvious place to look. It might be hard to think about science along these lines. We're so deeply conditioned to think about science, to identify science with knowledge, but it's totally obvious that we engage with the environment performatively. In the mangle, I mentioned the weather, but we could think about earthquakes and tidal waves. How else could we regard these than as manifestations of the agency of nature, to which we react performatively, trying to ward them off, usually through engineering, but never quite succeeding. And to bring this picture down to earth, I fixed on a couple of examples, which I can quickly run through now. One was the story about invasive species. Asian eels in the Midwest of the United States. Oh, I have a picture of that. That's what I'm talking about. This was an amusing story that I found in the newspapers about the importation of these eels to the US as pets in aquariums. The eels were quite small when they were brought over, but they turned out to grow quickly and rather horrifyingly, and were prone to climbing out of their tanks. So, to dramatise this, the first time I wrote about it, I imagined a little girl coming downstairs in her nightie in the middle of the night and seeing these jaws climbing out of the tank towards them. Kind of scene out of Alien. The owners of the eels therefore decided to get rid of them by throwing them in local ponds, where in fact the eels were very happy and they multiplied and competed successfully for food with the fish. This upset the fishermen, who liked catching largemouth bass in these ponds, so various tricks were tried to get rid of the eels, for example draining the ponds. This didn't work because the eels survived by burrowing into the mud, unlike the fish, which died. Then people tried building concrete barriers to stop the eels spreading to other ponds and waterways, but this failed too, because the eels just climbed over the barriers. For me, this is a beautiful example of a dance of agency, not now in the lab, but in the wild. A performative back and forth of the human and the non-human, in which the eels show up as always emergent, surprising, and unpredictable. And I want to ontologize this story. I want to take it as a model of how things go in the world in general. The world is full of agents which can interfere with one another consequentially, but without any sense of any of the agents controlling the other agents. We acted on the eels and made a difference for them, but the outcomes were not as hoped, they were emergent, and vice versa. All of this seems to be visibly true, but it just can't be said in the language of mainstream ecology, sociology, or philosophy. The disciplines cut up and edit the world in ways that make the couplings vanish. After the eels, I fixed on the Mississippi River and John McPhee's wonderful history of the struggles between the river and the US Army Corps of Engineers, the ACE. As McPhee tells it, this has been, again, a story of an emergent, performative back and forth. The river does something, it floods. The ACE does something in response, raising the levees, the banks, the margins of the river, building enormous control structures. The river responds to that, running higher, washing away the structures, etc., etc. Again, we have a dance of agency, now writ very large, in which the river, the engineering structures that hem it in, and indeed the social groups and structures that depend on the river, have all been emergently and unpredictably transformed, mangled over the past 150 years. So what I take from these examples is that there are interesting and possibly important things to say about our being in the environment in the performative idiom, as I call it. Things which are inexpressible in the language of the mainstream disciplines: civil engineering, hydrology, sociology, philosophy, whatever. Thinking about dances of agency offers what seems to me a new perspective, different from that of the conventional natural and social sciences. But so what? Where does this get us? We have an analysis of how things go in the world, but where do we go next? The thought that's been dawning on me over the years is that if we grasp this performative story of being in the world, we might act differently in the world. Somehow the shift to the performative idiom opens up new spaces for new kinds of practice. I think this is important, but it's also where I find myself disappearing yet further into academic outer space. I'll try to lay out my basic line of thought, and I'd be very interested to hear what you make of it. So, in the late 1990s, the University of Illinois, where I was then working, got a big grant to develop an interdisciplinary so-called capstone undergraduate course to mark the start of the new millennium. I ended up co-organising this course with a chap called Dave Ruzick from the Department of Nuclear Engineering. He taught the first class, and I remember he started off by calculating the so-called carrying capacity of the Earth. You figure out the total amount of arable land there is, how much it can produce with so much fertilizer and so much genetic engineering, and you divide by how much one person needs to live on, and this gives you an estimate of the total population the Earth can support. And he actually concluded that we don't need to worry too much at the moment. This is not, of course, an unusual way to reason. The students in the class had no problem with it, and in fact, it might be our usual way of thinking as far as global questions are concerned. It somehow exemplifies our usual way of governing the planet, our natural ontological attitude. But at the time I was struck by the hubris of it all, and now that I've kind of calmed down, I can say why. First, this way of thinking about things ignores emergence. It assumes we know all the chains of cause and effect, so that our initiatives will have the expected consequences, and only those. We are in control. We grasp the levers of power through knowledge. And everything I know contradicts this. The story of Glaser and the bubble chamber, the eels, the ace and the Mississippi. The world is too lively. We can interfere performatively with it, and it will respond, but there's no guarantee whatsoever that the response will be what we want and expect. Second, we could ask where emergence has gone in Ruzick's calculation. The answer is that conventional science substitutes for it, replacing a genuinely lively nature, what there is, with machine-like representations that we can reason around. The levers of power are clear on paper, in the equations, then, though not in the world. The same could be said of the Army Corps of Engineers. They too use the best science of hydrology in their dealings with the Mississippi. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. sometimes emergence breaks through, as in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Pretty obvious, the top left picture is the Mississippi River. Bottom right is the Army Corps of Engineers failing to control it and New Orleans being washed away. Where can we go now? One point that should be acknowledged, and that certainly needs more thought, which I just wrote a paper about, is that sometimes we do manage to get on top of nature, so to speak. Machines do work reliably. Roofs do keep the rain out. Usually we think of this in representational terms. Engineers explain to us how bubble chambers or nuclear reactors work in terms of some known laws of nature. And we usually treat that as the end of the story. So perhaps one virtue of the turn to performance is to open it up again. From my perspective, the production of reliable machines isn't primarily a cognitive achievement at all. It depends, rather, on finding performative islands of stability, as I call them, in intersections between the human and the non-human. These are not, in fact, guaranteed by knowledge. It's better instead to see knowledge as growing out of them. And they're chancy things. Our footing on them has to be continually adjusted in a performative fashion. Bubble chambers and nuclear power stations have to be serviced and maintained to keep them in shape. And this servicing and maintenance takes the form of yet more dances of agency. And we should recognise that sometimes we lose our footing. In the first generation of bubble chambers, for example, the Harvard-MIT bubble chamber just exploded, killing one person, injuring others, and causing millions of dollars worth of damage. For the equivalent in the world of nuclear power stations, words like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima will probably do the trick. But the question I want to consider now is, does my story of dances of agency help us think about other ways to go on in the world, other ways to conduct our performances? I think it does, actually. Our hegemonic way of governing the planet, our usual way of going on, is the one I just described. A stance of command and control dictating terms to nature, which Martin Heidegger called enframing. It entails a detour, as Bruno Latour would say, through science. We turn the world into scientific representations, figure out how to dominate those, and then remake the world in line with our calculations. This detour, of course, is where emergence disappears and where things can go horribly wrong. So what's the alternative? Skip the detour, forget about representation, forget about science, recognise instead that our being in the world is at root performative, and act that out. That's the basic idea of my talk, and now I think we really are in outer space. Words, language, symbols, representations, science, these are the stock in trade of us academics, and my recommendation is to forget about them, or to speak in more leisured terms. I want to put them in their place, to see things like knowledge and science as just a small part of a world of performance and becoming, by no means the centre of it. So I'm not really surprised when my colleagues look at me blankly when I say things like, forget about science. But let's press on a bit anyway. Really, the only question is, what would this other way of going on without science, which Heidegger called poesis, and I like to call the stance of revealing, look like? Could we live without the detour through science and knowledge? Let me try and spin out some examples in the spirit of an existence proof, moving from rather passive relations with nature to more active ones. So to begin, I live in the Exe Valley. You can see very easily where the floodplain of the Exe is, hemmed in by those nice Devon hills that you'll never know. The floodplain is basically flat fields populated by cows and sheep. When the river floods, as it does quite often, the cows, the sheep and the farmers stroll off to higher land. There are a few more or less ancient raised tracks crossing the floodplain, walkways, railways, roadways, which look pretty odd and intriguing most of the time, but whose purpose becomes totally obvious when the waters rise. So she's postcard. Oh, which nuclear reactor is this melting down? Yes, it's Fukushima. This is the bridge at Stoke Cannon that I go over every day. The weird thing about this bridge is you can't really tell it's foreshortened, but it's about 200 yards long. There's actually a little stream at the top and a puddle at the bottom and nothing in between. I used to drive over this every day and say, why is this stupid thing here? Which, it's only one-way traffic. And then, after I'd lived in Devon for a few months and it rained, and this just becomes, it's underwater when the river floods. That's the point of this weird bridge. It's not very clear at all. It's a kind of raised walkway which goes from Stoke Cannon to Bramford Speak, and I used to enjoy walking down here. There's the river on the left, the Exeter. It actually goes between two churches, and I used to imagine the monks getting from one church to another, and they had this raised walkway. And then somebody pointed out to me it was a disused railway line. Again, it's one of these strange structures. It's puzzling until the river floods, and it's quite obvious. So we could say that over the centuries, the people in the Exe Valley have found a way of living in dynamic equilibrium with the river. We could say that this has involved very little by way of a detour through science, and we could say that it works. The present configuration of the Exe Valley is the upshot of the stance of revealing, a performative openness to what the river will do, and a performative response to that. The beautiful village I live in, and the strange river architecture around it, have grown out of a long dance of agency. Of course, the Exe is just a little river. It's not so important in the grand scheme of things. The Rhine River, on the other hand, is very big and very important. And it strikes me that the kind of Room for the River project in Holland is a revival of this traditional stance I've been talking about. This big project in Holland, Room for the River, aims, as I understand it, to let the Rhine flood. It involves taking down all the levees that the Dutch had built on the banks of the Rhine for so long, and moving the farmers to higher land, in the spirit that it's better for us to adapt to regular finite floods, as in the Exe Valley, than to try to pin down and enframe the river, which is our usual way of going on, with the disasters and catastrophes that inevitably follow. And down where I live, you could think about the disastrous flooding of the Somerset levels and the great rains earlier this year. I'm tempted to call Room for Rivers a hylozoist project. Hylozoism, for me, is the idea that everything we need is there in nature already, and that we can latch onto it directly and performatively, instead of going through these long detours of cognition for the sake of bending nature to our will. I started thinking this way when I was trying to understand cybernetic biological computing projects in the 1950s and 1960s. There, the truly amazing idea was to entrain somehow pond ecosystems to manage factories. I realise that's a bit of a strange idea, it might need a bit of explanation, but let me just skip over it for the moment. I like this picture of a swamp, which is from a book by Gordon Pask, who was involved in this biological computing project. The interesting thing is that the swamp is labelled a real-life modular processor, question mark. Substitutes in some sense for a computer. Now it strikes me that water engineering in general might be moving in this hylozoist direction. A realization that maybe nature is better at controlling itself than we are. Okay, these were examples of a kind of performative letting go, and how it might actually work better than our usual enframing projects. Now I can turn to more active relations with nature. When I was at a meeting in Oxford a couple of years ago, Sarah Watmore showed us pictures of novel sorts of dams being built upstream of a Yorkshire town called Pickering, of all places. Here's one of the pictures that she showed us. The novelty of these dams is that they look as though they've been built by beavers rather than engineers. They're simply tangled meshes of branches thrown across a stream. I don't know whether they work, though I'll qualify that in a second, but what fascinates me about them is that rather than dominating streams via a detour through science, they stage a kind of exploratory dance of agency with them, finding out how nature will respond. Obviously, the state of the dams and how they act depends on their history, how much detritus has been washed down and caught by the dams or detached from them. Again, it says here, I don't know if they work, but anyway, this is a constructive example of this other way of going on, engineering in the mode of revealing rather than enframing and domination through knowledge. And I said I didn't know if they work, but then I was reading the New York Times on Tuesday, and I came across an article headlined, "Reversing Course on Beavers," about reintroducing beavers onto the west of the United States. I'll read you a couple of quotes. Beaver dams, it turns out, have beneficial effects that can't easily be replicated in other ways. They raise the water table along a stream, aiding the growth of plants and trees that stabilize the banks and prevent erosion. They improve fish and wildlife habitat and promote new, rich soil. And perhaps most important, in the west of the United States, beaver dams do what all dams do, hold back water that would otherwise drain away. That's real beaver dams. It carries on. In some other places, humans are building beaver dams, minus the beavers. On Norwegian Creek, a tiny thread of a stream that flows through the rolling grassy hills in a cattle ranch, volunteers came together recently to build a series of small structures from willow branches to slow the flow of water that had been eroding the banks to a depth of 10 feet or more. In just a year, the stream bed has risen 3 feet. Mr. Burrell said, and in a couple more years it could be entirely restored at virtually no cost. So I take back what I said. I do know whether these things work. They do work, right? And this is engineering in a mode of performance. Moving from the micro to the macro, I'm fascinated by the famous Dujiangyan Dam in China. That thing there. 2,000 years old, this dam is famous for the elegance of its performance. It acts differently according to the season and the water flow in the river, diverting water into irrigation channels when the level is low, and dampening out floods when the level is high. I haven't been able to find out much about the history of the dam's construction, but it's safe to say that it wasn't designed scientifically, and certainly its maintenance, at least, crucially entails a dance of human and non-human agency. The dam structure isn't fixed. Every year it's eroded by water flows, and every year it's rebuilt in line with the experience of the previous. And not coincidentally, I think, the dam is also one of the places where heaven and earth meet. There always seems to be a spiritual angle on these hylozoist relations with nature. Staying with China for a moment, we could think about the Chinese concept of shi, which I can't pronounce, but which I know is spelled S-H-I in our characters. As the title of Francois Julien's great book explains, shi refers to the propensity of things to act, to perform in specific ways. The moral here is that successful human action depends on latching on to the shi of whatever situation one finds oneself, in going with the flow in a Taoist sense. I'm told this way of thinking is just basic common sense in China, though it's pretty alien to Western academic thought. What puzzles me about it is how one is supposed to know which way the shi is pointing. What is the propensity of this arrangement or that? What is the propensity of this room at the moment? How can I go with it? I don't really know. But thinking about this can move us towards consideration of some even more active ways of relating to the environment in the mode of revealing. In his important book, Seeing Like a State, Jim Scott refers to a body of thought and action that he calls metis, which he sees as a less poisonous alternative to modernist rationalization and then framing. And he gives an example that I find striking of a traditional Japanese approach to the environment. Quote, "Erosion control in Japan is like a game of chess. The forest engineer, after studying his eroding valley, makes his first move, locating and building one or more check dams. He waits to see what nature's response is. This determines the forest engineer's next move, which may be another dam or two, an increase in the former dam, or the construction of side retaining walls. Another pause for observation. The next move is made, and so on, until erosion is checkmated. The operation of natural forces, such as sedimentation and revegetation, are guided and used to their best advantage to keep down costs and to obtain practical results." Clearly here, the forest engineer is finding out what the propensity of the valley and the water is. And he does that by deliberately staging a performative dance of agency with it. Trying this, seeing what happens, trying something else. So here we have a very nice example of a sort of purposeful finding out how to control nature without any detour through science and representation. A way of trading on the dance of agency rather than trying to short-circuit it through knowledge. One point worth emphasizing then is that the performative perspective doesn't require us simply to let nature go its own way, as in the X Valley. Rather, it opens up the possibility of foregrounding emergent dance with agency in practice, rather than casting a scientific veil over them. It might also be worth noting that one can speak of experiment in this connection. The Japanese forest engineer certainly experiments on water flows in the valley. But this isn't the same sense of experiment as that usually associated with science. Scientific experiment depends on the detour I've been talking about, the displacement of phenomena away from the world and into the lab for the sake of producing knowledge which can then be re-exported to the world, which is, for example, how the Army Corps of Engineers proceeds in its dealings with the Mississippi. Scott's example points to another sort of experiment, which entails performative interaction with the thing itself, with no displacement, no detour, and focused on performative outcome, rather than exportable knowledge. Experimentation in the wild, we could call it. And again, we can scale this example up and bring it more up to date. My one-time student, Lisa Asplin, wrote some beautiful papers about performative ways of getting along with the environment. The easiest one to think about is called adaptive management. Just like the Japanese example, adaptive management, as I understand it, is all about experimentation in the wild and staging dances of agency as a way of exploring the she of any given situation. Lisa talks about experimental floods on the Colorado River, staged downstream from the Glen Canyon Dam. That's the dam. The idea there was to find out how the river and the downstream ecosystem would react to different flows of water as a basis for further dealings with them. One important point that Lisa emphasizes is that while the scientists involved did have conventional scientific representations of river dynamics, they were prepared to find out that they were wrong, as indeed some of them were. Valuable monitoring equipment simply got washed away in these experiments. The river and the ecosystem reconfigured themselves in ways that surprised the scientists. This sort of experimentation in the wild, then, is alive to emergence in the dance of agency, interested in it, not trying to short-circuit it through knowledge. Lisa also wrote about projects of ecological restoration. These sound like classical enframing exercises, trying to make nature conform to a given representation of what it should look like. But what Lisa stressed is, again, that the restorers are themselves alive to emergence, allowing their targets to shift in the light of whatever emerges in the dance of agency. A whole new ecological formation in Illinois, in the case she studied. Okay, that's the end of my examples. Where have we got to? From one angle, my basic idea is that we can understand the world as built from performative dances of agency. That's what there is in the world. That's my ontological vision. Then my idea is that we usually contrive not to see that. We edit out the emergent aspects of the dance by substituting scientific representations for them, and then we act on the basis of those representations. Like Heidegger, I think this is our characteristic way of inhabiting the world in modernity, in relating to the environment and just about everything else. But a spin-off of my analysis is that it helps us imagine another way of being in the world, of experimenting directly in and learning from performative dances of agency, instead of conjuring them away via some kind of epistemological sleight of hand. I haven't dwelt on this, but I think it's also obvious from my examples that this other way of going on, the hylozoist stance of revealing, is, at the very least, much less prone to a catastrophic dark side than our usual stance of enframing and domination, which has to be something very much in favour of this other way of going on. From another angle, this talk is an attempt to persuade myself and others that there are interesting and perhaps important things to be said in the performative idiom. Like I said, I often feel like I've arrived in outer space, but I don't think it has to be outer space, even for academics. Actually, I think it should be our home, the place we set out from and return to in our explorations. And to finish, if I've got time, have I got time? Maybe I should explore a bit further how we should think about science itself. I said earlier that we should get rid of science, and I immediately qualified it by saying I really wanted to put science in its place. What's going on here? We can start by thinking about the sort of conventional scientific knowledge that my friend Dave Ruzick used in calculating the carrying capacity of the Earth. I feel like saying that it's okay to produce this sort of knowledge as a guide to the future, but that we should trust it less. The worst thing we can do is forget about emergence by adopting a hard, realist interpretation of current knowledge and putting it into practice, come what may. I'm afraid that's how we go on most of the time. I hope it's what environmental scientists are now realizing doesn't work very well and simply invites disasters. Instead, we should see scientific knowledge for what it is, a situated, partial, and retrospective way of making sense of what's happened so far. Cognitively, it's the best we can do. It's our main way of thinking about the future, but it's always liable to go wrong. Novelty will emerge from the dance of agency, and then we will, or should, revise our actions and beliefs. Practically, this means that when we try to act out our scientific visions, we should be alert for surprises and willing to modify both our knowledge and our plans accordingly. Constant monitoring of worldly performance. This is what I mean by saying we should trust science less. One of the cyberneticians that I studied, Stafford Beer, once wrote a paper with a great title, "The Surrogate World We Manage." His argument was that much management is totally focused on a paper world of representations, and the real world consequences of this range from regrettable to catastrophic. Think of the 2008 banking crisis, if you want a catastrophe. That is the sort of environmental management we need to be aware of. And I could just mention that this always seemed rather an abstract point to me until I moved back to Britain in 2007. I now work in one of these surrogate worlds that Beer warned us about. I'm sure that the University of Exeter looks splendid on paper. You can actually find diagrams of reporting chains and flowcharts on whiteboards in the administrators' offices. At the ground level, in contrast, we're all going mad, trying to reconcile teaching and research with a stream of totally unrealistic commands and diktats. I imagine many rivers feel the same, which, just to follow this tangent a bit further, reminds me of another cybernetician, Gregory Bateson. Bateson moved from an interest in schizophrenia in the 1950s to environmental concerns in the 60s and 70s. And he gave much the same analysis of mental problems and environmental problems. Both circle around attempts to stamp a modern blueprint onto an emergently lively system, trying to enframe cells and to enframe rivers respectively, and the disastrous consequences that can flow when either of these projects fail. Hurricane Katrina as the madness of the Mississippi, or madness as the Hurricane Katrina of the soil. I'm actually quite serious about these crossovers between psychiatry and environmental engineering. We can go back to science. I think it makes sense to distinguish between two different paradigms in Kuhn's sense for thinking about and acting in the world. One is the modern paradigm, exemplified in this talk by Rusic's calculations. As Heidegger said, this draws on the sort of science that makes the world calculable and sets it up for enframing and domination, turns the world into standing reserve. But there's a different kind of science that Heidegger didn't think about, which represents the world differently. Cybernetics would be one example of this other paradigm, but complexity theory and James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis are better known versions today. What can I say about this? First, I like the complexity approach a lot. Instead of linear models of cause and effect, it offers us a vision of basins of attraction in highly complex socio-ecological formations. Attractors that pull these entities back to specific sorts of states until one crosses a boundary or tipping point when they flip over to another attractor, for better or for worse. This sounds to me like a much better representation of how the world is than calculations of the carrying capacity of the Earth. And this sort of representation certainly serves as a warning against trying too quickly to edit out emergence, becoming and surprise. But two questions arise from a performative perspective. One goes back to the question of realism. Should we just believe these sorts of representations? Should they literally describe how the world is? My friend in the world of Deleuzean philosophy, Manuel de Landa, would say yes to that question, and then he'd start going on about attractors as the structure of the virtual. I'm inclined to say no. What complexity is good for is the construction of an alternative and non-modern imaginary for people who need that sort of thing. If you're a fan of science and you'd like to think your way out of enframing, read a few papers on complexity. This will show you how even a simple determinist world can nevertheless continually surprise us. But from another angle, I'm inclined to wonder what else complexity can do for us. I don't think there's much hope of ever pinning down the actual complexities of any important real ecosystem, of mapping the attractors and their boundaries. And I think there's even less hope of doing that for socio-ecological systems. In the end, and this is the end, what fascinates me is how necessary people find it to embark on incredibly long, expensive, and tiring detours through science to get hold of what sort of a place the world is. Why bother when you simply have to look? Why is it so hard for us to see that we live in a world that just is lively and surprising? It probably starts with what we teach our children in school. But that's another story. That's the end of my talk.